In December of 1942, amidst the vast expanse of the Solomon Islands, a harrowing scene unfolded frequently in the skies. 19-year-old Eddie Kowalski, a waist gunner aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress, found himself in a desperate struggle for survival. His hands, firm and determined, clutched the vibrating Browning M2 machine gun as a Japanese Zero fighter swiftly materialized at his 10 o'clock position. The enemy aircraft, approximately 300 yards distant, sliced across his field of vision from left to right with alarming speed. Instinctively, Eddie aligned his crosshairs directly onto the Zero's fuselage and unleashed a torrent of 50 rounds. The tracer fire arced vividly through the air, yet to his dismay, every single bullet sailed harmlessly behind the enemy plane's tail. The Japanese pilot, seemingly oblivious to the barrage, maintained his course, utterly unscathed, as Eddie's ammunition counter relentlessly dwindled. This disheartening incident was far from an isolated failure on Eddie's part. It was a tragically common occurrence that played out thousands of times across every theater of World War II during its initial years. American gunners, despite being meticulously trained, highly motivated, and equipped with the era's most advanced machine guns, were consistently failing to hit their targets. This wasn't an occasional lapse in accuracy. It was a pervasive and devastating problem. We invite you to stay with us and watch the conclusion of this compelling video. Your like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Please share in the comments where you are from and your thoughts on this critical aspect of wartime aviation. To address this alarming deficiency, the Army Air Forces initiated a comprehensive study in early 1943. Researchers meticulously analyzed gun camera footage from numerous bomber missions flown over both European and Pacific skies. The findings were nothing short of catastrophic. Even highly trained aerial gunners were achieving dismal hit rates, falling below a mere 4% against crossing targets. This meant that for every 100 rounds discharged at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicularly to the gunner's position, 96 bullets failed to make contact, vanishing into empty air. The mathematical implications of these statistics were brutal and stark. A typical aerial engagement against an enemy fighter might last for a brief window of 8 to 12 seconds before the adversary either disengaged or moved beyond effective range. The formidable Browning M2 machine gun possessed an impressive rate of fire, approximately 800 rounds per minute, translating to about 13 rounds per second. In a 10-second engagement, a gunner could theoretically discharge 130 rounds. However, with a devastating 4% hit rate, this meant that only about 5 bullets might actually strike the target. Crucially, 5 hits were woefully insufficient to bring down a nimble Japanese Zero, let alone a heavily armored and robust aircraft, such as the German Focke-Wulf FW-190. German and Japanese fighter aircraft, designed for resilience, could absorb dozens of .50 caliber rounds and still remain operational, continuing their attacks. The human toll of this inefficiency was staggering and immense. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force, operating over the heavily contested European theater, suffered an average loss of 188 bombers each month. Given that each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men, this translated to a heartbreaking total of 1,880 air crewmen killed, captured, or declared missing every 30 days. A substantial proportion of these devastating losses directly stemmed from bomber formations that simply could not mount an effective defense against determined fighter attacks. The gunners, in their earnest efforts, were meticulously adhering to every tenet of their training, tracking the target with precision, maintaining a clear sight picture, and controlling their bursts of fire. The fundamental issue was not a lack of courage or commitment on their part. The true adversary was an immutable force, physics. And physics, indifferent to human bravery, dictated the harsh realities of aerial ballistics. Every gunner, by a natural human instinct, aimed directly at what they could visually perceive. This logic seemed perfectly sound. One points at the object intended to be hit, pulls the trigger, and expects the object to be struck. This straightforward principle functions flawlessly when engaging a stationary target on a rifle range, or even when hunting a deer moving at a relatively modest 20 miles per hour. However, enemy fighters were not slow-moving deer. They were crossing the gunner's field of view at blistering speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Some of the advanced late-war models, such as the German Me-262 jet, could achieve velocities of 540 miles per hour. At such extreme speeds, the finite amount of time it took for a bullet to traverse the distance from the gun muzzle to the target's position meant that the target had invariably moved on by the time the projectile arrived. The bullet itself, leaving the barrel of a Browning M2, traveled at an impressive velocity of approximately 2,900 feet per second. This speed might appear instantaneous, and indeed, at very short ranges against slow-moving targets, it effectively was. Yet, in the dynamic realm of aerial combat, short range typically implied distances of 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were screaming through the sky at speeds that would have been unimaginable just 2 decades prior. A Japanese Zero, hurtling at 300 miles per hour, covered a distance of 440 feet every single second. A simple calculation reveals the critical flaw. On a 300-yard shot, equivalent to 900 feet, with a bullet speed of 2,900 feet per second, the projectile required approximately 0.31 seconds to bridge that distance. While this duration might seem negligible, in those fleeting 0.31 seconds, that Zero advanced an additional 136 feet, a distance roughly equivalent to 11 car lengths. Consequently, the gunner aimed at the aircraft's present location, but the bullet arrived at the position the aircraft had occupied a third of a second earlier, passing harmlessly through empty air while the enemy fighter continued its trajectory, completely unscathed. This critical phenomenon was formerly known as deflection error. Military scientists had a theoretical understanding of deflection error long before the outbreak of World War II, but comprehending a concept in a classroom setting and effectively solving it in the chaos of combat were entirely distinct challenges. The required deflection was not a minor adjustment. It was massive, counterintuitive, and fundamentally at odds with human instinct. Against a target crossing at a 90-degree angle at a distance of 300 yards, a gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. This meant positioning one's crosshairs on what appeared to be completely empty sky, relying on the conviction that the target would subsequently fly into the stream of bullets. Every innate human instinct fiercely rebelled against such an action. Gunnery instructors made earnest attempts to teach deflection shooting during training exercises, but the practical results were consistently dismal. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo, Texas, implemented rigorous training programs beginning in 1942. Trainees dedicated countless hours to practicing in turret simulators, fired at towed targets from moving trucks, and meticulously studied complex diagrams illustrating proper lead angles. Despite these extensive efforts, very little of this specialized training effectively translated into successful application during actual combat scenarios. The core of the problem lay in its inherent complexity. Deflection was not a singular, fixed calculation. It was a dynamic variable that constantly changed depending on a multitude of factors, including target speed, the target's angle of approach, the range to the target, the altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, and even whether the gunner's own aircraft was turning. A B-17 ball turret gunner engaging a Bf-109, making a frontal attack required a completely different deflection angle than the same gunner engaging the same aircraft during a beam attack from the side. And critically, that gunner had a mere 4 seconds, often less, to process all these intricate variables while simultaneously enduring enemy fire, as his aircraft bucked and shuddered from flak damage, and as his oxygen mask frequently fogged up at 25,000 feet. The psychological barrier proved to be just as lethal as the technical one. Gunners who managed to survive their initial few missions and attempted to implement deflection shooting often abandoned the technique after experiencing apparent failures. They would aim ahead of a target, unleash a burst of fire, observe their tracers arcing through what appeared to be empty sky in front of the enemy plane, and erroneously conclude that they had led too much. In the subsequent engagement, they would inevitably reduce their lead, moving their aim point closer to the visible target. In doing so, they were self-correcting in precisely the wrong direction, trusting their immediate visual perception over the unseen, yet immutable, laws of physics. Gun camera footage meticulously collected from 1943 missions repeatedly illustrated this detrimental pattern. Initial bursts often showed some degree of forward lead, but these were invariably followed by subsequent bursts that walked backward until the gunner was firing directly at, or even slightly behind, the target's current visible position. The casualties mounted with horrifying regularity. 8th Air Force records from the devastating October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt revealed a staggering 20% loss rate, 60 bombers failing to return out of 291 dispatched. The surviving aircraft limped back to base, carrying dead and wounded crewmen, their hydraulic lines shredded, and engines trailing ominous plumes of smoke. In the debriefings that followed, gunners consistently reported the same profound frustration. They had been shooting, their guns had functioned perfectly, but their bullets simply had not been connecting with the enemy. Something fundamental had to change, and it had to change with extreme urgency, because at the current unsustainable loss rates, the Allied bombing campaign was destined to collapse long before it could ever reach its strategic objectives in Berlin. Remarkably, the solution to this critical problem had been gathering dust in a filing cabinet since 1924, authored by a man most combat aircrews had never even heard of. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, not to be confused with the historical Puckle who invented the defense gun, but an American artillery officer possessing an exceptional talent for ballistics, had published a highly technical paper titled, "The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery." He had written this seminal work while serving as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School. Puckle was far from a detached, theoretical academic. His insights were grounded in practical experience. He had served with distinction in France during World War I, where he had witnessed the nascent, clumsy attempts at air-to-air combat. This first-hand experience led him to recognize that the rapidly increasing speeds of aviation were on the verge of creating a profound targeting crisis that traditional marksmanship principles simply could not resolve. His meticulously researched paper laid out the complex mathematics with brutal clarity. Puckle demonstrated unequivocally that as aircraft speeds escalated beyond 150 miles per hour, the required deflection angles would exceed the intuitive capabilities of human gunners. He calculated that against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target. His paper included extensive tables and exhaustive charts, meticulously detailing the required lead for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. For instance, a 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300 miles per hour target necessitated a lead of 47 feet. The identical target at 400 yards demanded a staggering lead of 94 feet. These numbers were immense, and Puckle's ultimate conclusion was even more disturbing. Without the aid of mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would become effectively useless within a decade. Despite its profound implications, the Army filed Puckle's groundbreaking paper and, lamentably, forgot about it. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation underwent rapid and transformative advancements, yet gunnery training remained stubbornly rooted in outdated World War I methodologies. Instructors continued to teach fundamental marksmanship principles, sight picture, trigger control, breath control, as if their students were preparing for a static rifle competition rather than engaging in a dynamic, three-dimensional chase at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. The brutal reality of high-speed, three-dimensional aerial pursuit, often exceeding 300 miles per hour, presented an unprecedented challenge to traditional marksmanship. Initial warnings from a few prescient voices advocating for specialized deflection training were largely dismissed as overly cautious alarmism. The prevailing sentiment was rooted in a deep-seated national pride in American marksmanship, a legacy stretching back to figures like Daniel Boone and Sergeant York, embodying a frontier tradition of sharpshooting excellence. It was widely presumed that these ingrained ground-based proficiencies would seamlessly transfer to the dynamic environment of aerial combat with sufficient practice, a belief that ultimately proved to be tragically mistaken. Upon the United States' entry into the Second World War in December 1941, the Army Air Force's gunnery training programs were starkly, even catastrophically, ill-equipped for the unforgiving demands of modern air warfare. The standard instructional regimen was woefully brief, spanning a mere 4 weeks, during which students expended approximately 1,000 rounds of ammunition in total throughout their entire qualification course. The vast majority of this limited ordnance was directed at stationary targets or slowly towed sleeves, which ambled along at perhaps 150 miles per hour in predictable, straight trajectories. Not a single simulated scenario managed to replicate the sheer pandemonium of a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter, for instance, plummeting through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while simultaneously executing intricate evasive maneuvers such as a barrel roll. New graduates, having received their wings, would embark on their combat tours in bombers destined for theaters like England or the Pacific, only to discover the utter futility of their training the moment an enemy Zero fighter flashed menacingly across their gun's sight. By mid-1942, a profound sense of desperation permeated commanding ranks, prompting a frantic search through historical technical libraries for any viable solutions. It was amidst this urgent quest that Captain Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section, stumbled upon Puckle's insightful 1924 paper within the dusty archives at Wright Field. Williams absorbed the entire document in a single sitting, his subsequent memo to his commanding officer bearing a stark, thrice-underlined declaration. He knew. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Puckle, with astonishing prescience, had accurately foreseen this exact operational catastrophe a full 18 years before the first B-17 Flying Fortress ever flew a combat mission over the embattled skies of Europe. His intricate calculations remained entirely accurate, and his urgent warnings, though ignored, had proven undeniably correct. The grim consequence of this collective oversight was the needless sacrifice of hundreds of American air crewmen, who perished because their cries for effective preparation had gone unheeded. The fundamental question was no longer whether Puckle's assertions were valid, the underlying mathematics were irrefutable. Instead, the critical inquiry revolved around the feasibility of implementing any practical solution. The notion of training gunners to consciously compute complex deflection angles while simultaneously under enemy fire seemed inherently impossible. The human brain, after all, simply lacked the processing speed to execute intricate trigonometric calculations at the blistering pace of aerial combat. However, if conscious calculation proved to be an insurmountable obstacle, then perhaps an alternative, less direct approach might yield the desired results. Coincidentally, the British had already begun to unearth some answers, spurred by a similar wave of desperation during the pivotal summer of 1940. Royal Air Force Squadron 609, operating its formidable Spitfires from the airbase at Middle Wallop, found itself embroiled in a gunnery crisis that strikingly mirrored the challenges American bombers would face approximately 2 years later. While their pilots exhibited immense bravery and their aircraft were engineering marvels, a critical flaw persisted. Their shots were consistently missing their intended targets. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas meticulously reviewed gun camera footage from engagements throughout July and uncovered a deeply troubling statistic. His squadron's hit rate against maneuvering Messerschmitt Bf 109s was hovering at an abysmal 6%. This meant that only 6 shots out of every 100 fired were actually connecting. Considering that a Spitfire carried enough ammunition for roughly 16 seconds of continuous firing, pilots were rapidly expending their entire combat load, only to watch German fighters disengage and return to base, seemingly untouched. In response to this dire situation, squadron leader Harry Darley, the commanding officer of 609 Squadron, made a truly radical and highly controversial decision. In early August 1940, precisely when every available fighter was desperately needed in the air during the height of the Battle of Britain, he grounded his entire unit for 3 days. During this critical period, Darley conducted a series of live-fire experiments that directly violated every established standard and protocol outlined in the official RAF training manual. Darley's unique perspective stemmed from his pre-war experience as a competitive clay pigeon shooter. He possessed an intuitive understanding of leading moving targets that had eluded conventional military theorists. The most adept shotgun shooters, he realized, did not consciously compute lead. Rather, they developed an innate feel for it. Their brains processed the target's movement subconsciously, allowing their hands to instinctively position the shotgun barrel ahead of the clay disc without engaging in explicit mathematical thought processes. Darley pondered whether fighter pilots could cultivate a similar instinctive response. His experimental design was brutally simple yet profoundly effective. He arranged for a Hurricane fighter to tow a target banner across the gunnery range, while his Spitfire pilots conducted repeated firing passes. However, instead of adhering to the standard approach, where pilots meticulously aimed and attempted to calculate the precise lead angle, Darley issued an instruction that, at the time, must have sounded completely insane. Do not aim at all. Instead, focus intently on the target's movement. Allow your eyes to track its trajectory and commence firing while your aircraft is still in the process of turning to follow it. Permit the necessary deflection to occur naturally through the motion of your turn, rather than attempting to consciously create it with deliberate aiming adjustments. Direct your fire towards the predicted future position of the target, guided by your instincts, not merely where your eyes currently perceive it to be. The initial attempts were unmitigated disasters. Pilots frequently missed the target banner by as much as 50 feet, their bullets stitching indiscriminate patterns across the empty sky. Undeterred, Darley compelled them to repeat the exercise again and again, a grueling regimen of 40 passes each over the course of 3 days. There were no verbose lectures on ballistics, no complex trigonometry lessons, no cumbersome tables of deflection angles, only relentless repetition coupled with one simple, unwavering instruction. Fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the third day, a truly remarkable transformation began to unfold. The pilots' hit rates, while not skyrocketing dramatically, started to climb discernibly. They ascended from a meager 6% to perhaps 12%. This seemingly modest doubling, however, held profound implications. It signified twice as many bullets finding their mark on German aircraft, which in turn translated to twice as many confirmed kills or, at the very least, twice as many damaged enemy fighters returning to base, incapacitated and unable to participate in subsequent missions. Darley meticulously documented his compelling results and formally submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His comprehensive report included a crucial observation. The pilots who demonstrated the most rapid improvement were not necessarily those who had achieved the best peacetime marksmanship scores. Rather, they were the individuals who possessed the ability to suppress their ingrained instinct to aim with meticulous precision, choosing instead to trust their peripheral vision and their intuitive sense of motion. Darley argued forcefully that the conscious brain was simply too slow and cumbersome for the lightning-fast demands of modern air combat. The solution, he posited, lay in training the subconscious mind to automatically manage deflection, much in the same way a baseball player's brain instinctively calculates where a flyball will land without consciously solving complex trajectory equations. Fighter Command subsequently disseminated Darley's groundbreaking findings, but the implementation across squadrons proved to be scattered and inconsistent. While some units enthusiastically adopted the innovative technique, others summarily dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's established training command, in particular, exhibited significant resistance. Their instructors, steeped in decades of experience teaching the fundamentals of traditional marksmanship, perceived Darley's unconventional approach as a wholesale abandonment of everything they knew about proper shooting discipline. Yet, the undeniable evidence from combat results spoke for itself. Squadrons that wholeheartedly embraced motion-based deflection shooting consistently demonstrated measurably superior kill ratios throughout the autumn of 1940. The empirical data was sufficiently compelling that by early 1941, the technique was quietly but firmly becoming standard practice, even if the official training manuals had yet to catch up with this combat-proven innovation. American military observers stationed in Britain diligently took detailed notes on Darley's revolutionary methods. However, the United States Army Air Forces faced a distinct and formidable challenge. While fighter pilots could potentially learn instinctive deflection through rigorous repetition, bomber gunners were inherently limited in this regard. A Spitfire pilot commanded their entire aircraft, deftly utilizing its motion and angles to generate natural lead. In stark contrast, a waist gunner in a B-17 Flying Fortress stood in a fixed position while their aircraft maintained a straight and level course through intense anti-aircraft fire, unable to maneuver, and thus unable to leverage aircraft movement to generate the necessary deflection. Their only tools were their hands on the gun and their eyes fixed on the target. Given that conscious calculation was too slow for the gunner, and instinctive motion-based solutions were unavailable due to the bomber's rigid flight path, the imperative shifted towards a mechanical solution. This urgent need led to the involvement of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically the establishment of Division 7 within its radiation laboratory in early 1942. The name, Radiation Laboratory, was a deliberate and ingenious misdirection. It cleverly suggested atomic research, which effectively helped maintain secrecy around Division 7's true mission. the development of sophisticated fire control systems. The division was headed by Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a brilliant 40-year-old engineer who had dedicated the preceding decade to developing advanced gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper possessed a profound understanding that the deflection problem was not fundamentally about the act of shooting itself. Rather, it was intrinsically about prediction. An effective gun sight, he reasoned, needed to display to the gunner not merely where the target was at that exact moment, but precisely where the target would be at the anticipated moment of bullet impact. This conceptual breakthrough culminated in the emergence of the Mark 14 computing gun sight, which materialized from Draper's laboratory in prototype form by July 1943. The Mark 14 computing gun sight appeared to be something straight out of science fiction, a complex assembly comprising a reflector sight seamlessly integrated with a sophisticated gyroscope system. This entire unit weighed a substantial 28 pounds and required a dedicated electrical power supply from the aircraft's generator system. The gunner operated it through a mechanical ranging control. By turning a dial, they would align a set of reference marks with the target's wingspan, thereby providing the sight with the crucial range information it required. Subsequently, the gunner would track the target for approximately 2 seconds, diligently keeping it centered within a small tracking circle. During those critical 2 seconds of tracking, the integrated gyroscope meticulously measured the target's angular velocity, precisely how fast it was traversing the gunner's field of view. Herein lay the truly remarkable ingenuity. The Mark 14's internal mechanism employed an intricate series of cams and gears, effectively functioning as an analog computer meticulously constructed from precision machined metal to solve the complex deflection equation in real time. It seamlessly integrated the range input provided by the gunner, the angular velocity data supplied by the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the powerful .50 caliber round, then precisely calculated exactly how far ahead of the target the guns needed to be pointed to ensure an accurate hit. This innovative targeting device presented its calculated solution as an illuminated reticle, seemingly suspended in the void directly ahead of the aerial adversary. Gunners no longer needed to meticulously track the enemy aircraft itself. Their focus shifted entirely to aligning their weapons with this luminous indicator. Provided the range had been accurately determined and the target smoothly followed, the glowing dot precisely indicated the optimal point of fire. The Mark 14 sight masterfully performed intricate mathematical computations that would have consumed several arduous minutes for a human mind armed only with pencil and paper. Astonishingly, it executed these complex equations with incredible speed, processing them 30 times every second, continuously adapting its calculations as the target's angular position and distance fluctuated in the dynamic combat environment. Trials conducted at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, throughout August 1943, yielded outcomes that bordered on the miraculous. Gunners, who had previously struggled to achieve hit rates exceeding a mere 5% against challenging crossing targets, experienced an immediate and dramatic improvement, soaring to 18% on their very first day of utilizing the Mark 14 system. Following a week of dedicated practice, these impressive rates further ascended, stabilizing above 25%. This represented a profound five-fold enhancement over traditional manual aiming techniques, a statistical leap that directly translated into a five-fold increase in the number of enemy aircraft damaged or utterly destroyed during each engagement. Such a paradigm shift in aerial combat effectiveness underscored the revolutionary potential of this new technology. However, the monumental undertaking of manufacturing and subsequently integrating tens of thousands of these sophisticated Mark 14 sights across the vast Allied bomber fleet demanded a considerable investment of time, a luxury the Allied forces simply could not afford during the critical stages of the conflict. Substantial production volumes did not commence until the early months of 1944, and the strategic priority for installation was allocated to newly constructed aircraft rolling off assembly lines, rather than retrofitting the immense number of existing bombers already in service. Consequently, the overwhelming majority of gunners flying perilous missions through late 1943 and into early 1944 were still compelled to rely on rudimentary iron sights or basic reflector sights, entirely devoid of any computational capabilities. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. There was an urgent and immediate requirement for an alternative solution, one that could be implemented instantly, without the protracted wait for novel technological advancements or the need for intricate electrical modifications to their existing aircraft. What was desperately needed was a practical technique that functioned seamlessly with the equipment already at hand. This crucial breakthrough did not originate from the minds of highly educated engineers or esteemed scientists, but rather from the very combat gunners themselves, specifically those operating in the Pacific Theater of Operations. In this region, engagement distances were frequently more extensive, and visibility conditions often proved superior to the perpetually cloud-shrouded skies over Europe, fostering an environment where practical observation could lead to innovative solutions. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, who served as a waist gunner within the USS Lexington's Air Group Support Staff, had, by March 1944, amassed an extraordinary record of 31 combat missions and remarkably survived the loss of 4 separate aircraft. Fleming was not a commissioned officer, did not possess a college education, and would have been utterly incapable of elucidating the principles of gyroscopic precession even if his life depended upon it. Nevertheless, he had discharged an estimated 40,000 rounds in actual combat, and had personally observed successful hits on no fewer than 7 enemy aircraft, a testament to his raw skill and extensive practical experience. Beyond his impressive combat record, he had meticulously maintained a personal notebook. Fleming's unassuming ledger contained an extraordinary and highly unconventional collection of entries, detailed sketches of various enemy aircraft, accompanied by hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses. These lines precisely indicated the point where he had actually aimed during engagements that resulted in confirmed hits. He had ingeniously quantified these critical lead distances by visually comparing them to the length of the target aircraft itself. For instance, 2 plane lengths ahead, or 3 plane lengths ahead, thereby creating a practical and easily understandable metric. On March 14, 1944, Fleming formally presented his invaluable notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare during what was otherwise a routine debriefing session. O'Hare, a celebrated Medal of Honor recipient and widely regarded as one of the Navy's most astute tacticians, instantly grasped the profound significance of what he was being shown. He recognized it as empirical deflection data, meticulously gathered under the unforgiving crucible of actual combat conditions, offering unparalleled insights into effective aerial gunnery. O'Hare swiftly issued orders for Fleming to conduct intensive training sessions with every single gunner within the air group. These were not to be conventional classroom lectures filled with abstract theories, but rather hands-on, practical exercises centered around a remarkably straightforward technique that soon became widely known as the spot shooting method. During these sessions, Fleming would position gunners at their designated firing stations, while another crew member traversed the flight deck, holding a model aircraft aloft on a pole. As the miniature aircraft flew past at various simulated angles, Fleming expertly coached the gunners to extend their aim forward by specific, easily quantifiable increments. 1 aircraft length for targets at slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for those at moderate angles, and 3 or more lengths for particularly steep crossing shots. The fundamental genius of this approach lay in providing gunners with an intuitive visual reference that they could instantly recall and apply without conscious deliberation. The instruction was remarkably simple. Count plane lengths forward from the nose, then open fire. Initially skeptical but ultimately desperate for any viable method that might improve gunnery accuracy, the Lexington's gunnery officer granted authorization for controlled testing of this new technique. These trials were conducted during the carrier's operational period off Truck Lagoon in late March 1944. He meticulously compiled data on ammunition expenditure and confirmed hits for the preceding 8 weeks, then rigorously tracked the identical metrics following the implementation of Fleming's comprehensive training program. The subsequent results proved to be utterly irrefutable. Prior to the introduction of Fleming's specialized training, the gunners of the Air Group had achieved an average of merely 4.2 hits for every 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the close of April, a mere 6 weeks after the systematic implementation of the spot shooting method, that hit rate had dramatically ascended to an impressive 9.1 hits per 100 rounds. This revolutionary technique had, in essence, more than doubled their combat effectiveness, providing a critical advantage in the ongoing aerial battles. News of this remarkably effective method disseminated throughout the Pacific Fleet with astonishing rapidity. By May 1944, various adaptations of Fleming's ingenious spot shooting technique were actively being taught aboard prominent carriers such as the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. While the gunnery officers on each carrier introduced their own minor refinements and instructional nuances, the fundamental core principle remained steadfast: to equip gunners with an uncomplicated visual measurement system directly correlated to the apparent size of the target, thereby obviating the need for complex, conscious calculations. A gunner no longer required an intellectual understanding of compensating for example, 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. He simply needed to instinctively recall that 3 plane lengths forward constituted the correct lead for a crossing shot. The technique's efficacy stemmed from its profound alignment with the inherent mechanisms of human visual processing. Our brains are remarkably adept at making relative size comparisons, yet notoriously poor at accurately estimating absolute distances. Instructing a gunner to lead by an abstract measure like 50 feet held little practical meaning when he lacked any tangible reference for what 50 feet actually looked like at a range of 300 yards. Conversely, the command, "Lead by 2 plane lengths," furnished him with an immediate, concrete visual standard that could be applied instinctively, without conscious thought. The target he was actively tracking thus provided its own inherent measuring stick. He merely had to project that observable measurement forward into the empty expanse of space. By mid-1944, the Army Air Forces had similarly adopted comparable training protocols, though they designated their version as radius of action shooting. Technical manuals began to incorporate illustrative diagrams explicitly depicting proper lead distances, expressed as multiples of the target's wingspan or fuselage length. The prestigious 8th Air Force Gunnery School, situated at Lavenham, England, undertook a complete overhaul of its entire training curriculum around this highly effective technique during June 1944, underscoring its widespread acceptance and perceived critical importance. While still regrettably significant, mission loss rates for bombers began to exhibit a noticeable decline. Data from July 1944 indicated 3.4% bomber losses per mission, a marked improvement compared to the 5.2% recorded in the preceding October. This tangible difference represented hundreds of valuable crew members who successfully returned to base, escaping the grim fate of perishing over German skies, a direct testament to the efficacy of improved gunnery. However, merely understanding the theoretical aspects of the technique and successfully executing it under the harrowing conditions of actual combat remain two entirely distinct and profoundly challenging endeavors. The human brain, even when equipped with the ostensibly straightforward spot shooting method, frequently found itself at war with its own instincts once the shooting commenced. Psychologists embedded within the Army Air Forces meticulously documented this pervasive phenomenon throughout 1944, conducting extensive interviews with returning gunners. The core issue was not a lack of knowledge. Gunners were often able to perfectly articulate the correct lead distances during post-mission debriefings. The fundamental problem was that this conscious knowledge invariably evaporated under the immense pressures of combat, supplanted by a primal, overwhelming instinct that relentlessly screamed, "Aim directly at the threat." Captain Harold Klenn, an Army psychologist stationed at Bovington, undertook an intensive study of this very response. His research involved a meticulous analysis of gun camera footage, carefully paired with in-depth post-mission interviews. Through this rigorous examination, he identified a recurring pattern that he aptly termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would typically initiate an engagement by employing the proper deflection, but as the enemy fighter rapidly closed in and the perceived danger dramatically intensified, their aim point would progressively drift backward. This drift would continue until they were firing directly at, or even discernibly behind, the target. Klenn's compelling data unequivocally demonstrated that this collapse occurred most rapidly during head-on attacks, where the closing speed between the bomber and the fighter exceeded a staggering 500 miles per hour, leaving the gunner with perhaps a mere 2 seconds before the enemy unleashed its own fire. Under such extreme and debilitating stress, rational technique dissolved entirely into pure, instinctual reaction. Point at the terrifying object, pull the trigger. The singular, definitive solution to this deeply ingrained human response lay in a level of repetition so extensive and profound that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought altogether, becoming ingrained at the same fundamental neurological level as automatic actions, like walking or catching a thrown ball. Achieving this required a dedicated investment of training time that the military simply could not afford during the frantic years of 1942 and 1943. Nevertheless, by late 1944, with Allied control of the air steadily improving and training pipelines becoming more firmly established, gunnery schools were finally able to significantly extend their programs. The standard course, which had been a mere 4 weeks in 1942, expanded progressively to 8 weeks, and then to a full 10 weeks. Students now discharged an impressive 5,000 rounds during their training, a 5-fold increase over the previous 1,000. Crucially, over half of these rounds were directed at moving targets, simulating realistic combat speeds and angles. The Naval Air Gunner School at Jacksonville, Florida, spearheaded a particularly innovative and highly effective drill commencing in August 1944. They ingeniously mounted .50 caliber machine guns onto motorized turrets, specifically designed to spin and elevate with rapid agility. These turrets then engaged targets towed across the water by high-speed boats, which moved at velocities up to 60 miles per hour while randomly varying their distance and crossing angles. Gunner trainees repeatedly engaged these dynamic targets, undertaking between 50 and 70 passes per day, until the complex act of leading the target became a completely automatic, subconscious action. Instructors deliberately refrain from verbally correcting students during these intensive drills. Instead, they simply allow the trainees to shoot, observe their hit patterns, make their own adjustments, and then shoot again. This feedback loop-driven approach allowed the subconscious mind to learn and adapt with far greater speed and efficacy than conscious instruction alone could achieve. The human mind, when rigorously trained through precise instruction, can achieve remarkable feats. An analysis of combat footage from World War II revealed an extraordinary capacity among elite gunners who had successfully navigated 30 or more missions. Their aiming points for deflection remained steadfastly stable, even when subjected to profound duress. When a fearsome FW-190 fighter screamed through the formation, its cannons flashing menacingly from its wings, these seasoned gunners instinctively held the necessary lead. While their intellects might have been gripped by terror, indeed, many confessed to being absolutely convinced of their imminent demise during specific engagements, their hands, nonetheless, maintained the optimal targeting alignment. They had attained a state akin to what martial artists term mushin, or no mind, a profound mental condition where intricate technique unfolds without any conscious direction. Yet, achieving this rare level of proficiency demanded extensive time and a volume of ammunition that the vast majority of gunners simply never received. The unforgiving mathematics of wartime training presented an insurmountable challenge. If cultivating an expert deflection shooter necessitated 5,000 practice rounds and a rigorous 10 weeks of intensive instruction, but the strategic bomber offensive urgently required 50,000 new gunners within a mere 6-month timeframe, sacrifices in training quality became unavoidable. Consequently, the bulk of the gunnery corps flying combat missions never achieved true unconscious competence, that innate, automatic mastery. Instead, they consistently operated at the level of deliberate, learned proficiency, capable of executing proper deflection shooting when conditions afforded them sufficient time for conscious thought. However, this left them susceptible to breakdown under overwhelming pressure or when confronting unforeseen tactical situations, where rapid, instinctual reactions were paramount. This disparity inevitably fostered a peculiar hierarchy of combat prowess. A bomber formation's protective fusillade lacked consistency. Its overall effectiveness was profoundly contingent upon which specific gunners occupied which particular positions on which individual aircraft. A formation that, by chance, included a contingent of seasoned veterans possessing extensive instruction could successfully repel assaults that might otherwise prove ruinous to a formation composed primarily of newer crews. German fighter pilots, with keen observational skills, learned to identify and capitalize on this vulnerability. They would target bombers that displayed tentative or imprecise volleys during initial passes, while judiciously avoiding formations where the defensive fire was prompt, formidable, and meticulously aimed, signaling the presence of highly trained and experienced opponents. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video. We would be grateful for your like and subscription. Please feel free to share a comment about where you are from and what you think about this topic. The paradigm shift in aiming methodology, known as deflection shooting, which originated with pioneering British experiments and was propelled by American desperation, persisted far beyond the conclusion of World War II in 1945. The fundamental tenet, that one must direct one's aim to where the target will be, not merely where it is, became a cornerstone for all subsequent armaments. The Mark 14 computing gun sight, a mechanical marvel of its time, underwent further refinement, becoming the Mark 18, which valiantly served through the Korean War. This lineage then progressed into sophisticated digital fire-controlled computers capable of evaluating a multitude of dynamic factors concurrently. By the era of the Vietnam War, fighter aircraft were equipped with radar-assisted gun systems that computed the necessary lead autonomously, necessitating merely that aviators maintain their adversaries within predefined targeting envelopes. The F-4 Phantom's advanced lead computing optical sight system accomplished in mere microseconds what previously demanded substantial fractions of a second from Draper's intricate mechanical gyroscopes. In contemporary times, modern air-to-air combat has predominantly transcended the reliance on ballistic weaponry. Missiles now facilitate engagement over distances where deflection would necessitate anticipating movement across vast distances, measured in miles, as opposed to mere increments of feet. Nevertheless, the fundamental physical laws remain immutable, though their practical application has transformed. An AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, for instance, employs inertial guidance and active radar to perpetually adjust its flight path towards its predicted target location, performing lead computations with astounding frequency, thousands per second. Similarly, the F-22 Raptors and APG-77 radar does not solely track targets. It proactively forecasts their subsequent locations based on current velocity and acceleration, then orientates the aircraft and designates appropriate armaments in response. It is the identical challenge that William Fleming addressed with rudimentary hand-drawn sketches in 1944, now managed by sophisticated computing systems operating at teraflop speeds, rather than human gunners estimating distances in plane lengths. Remarkably, foundational principles of deflection shooting persist within modern fighter pilot training. Despite guns being supplementary armaments in contemporary air combat, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, famously known as Top Gun, continues to instruct in core aerial combat tactics that include guns-only engagements. This is not because pilots anticipate engaging in dogfights solely with cannons, but rather because learning to visually predict the future position of a maneuvering target cultivates an acute perception of three-dimensional space and dynamic movement, a spatial awareness that is pertinent across the entire spectrum of aerial engagements. A pilot who has mastered deflection shooting instinctively grasps the dynamics of closing velocities, angular displacement, and optimal interception trajectories. These are fundamental concepts critical regardless of whether one is deploying ballistic rounds or aligning for a missile launch. The insights gleaned from this domain transcend the realm of aerial warfare, extending into any field where high-velocity projectiles are engaged. Modern anti-aircraft systems, from the phalanx CIWS defending naval vessels to the CRAM protecting ground bases, are fundamentally advanced iterations of what those 1943 bomber gunners endeavored to accomplish by hand. The phalanx, for example, unleashes 4,500 rounds per minute, a staggering 75 rounds per second, at incoming missiles and aircraft. Its radar perpetually computes the necessary lead and refines its targeting solution. It executes the identical adjustments Eddie Kowalski needed to make over the Solomon Islands, but with vastly superior speed and, crucially, devoid of the human uncertainty that tragically claimed countless lives. Even video games that simulate combat integrate the principles of lead aiming, imparting to participants the identical, initially bewildering concept: aim where the target is going. Titles such as War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator mandate that users manually anticipate the trajectory of dynamic adversaries. New players, consequently, encounter the precise exasperation that 1942 gunners felt, watching their tracers traverse innocuously astern of hostile planes until they assimilate the critical requirement for lead compensation. The most skilled players, through practice, cultivate the identical automatic mastery that combat veterans achieved, their hands calibrating their targeting without deliberate mental processing. The evolution from abysmal 4% hit rates in early 1943 to over 20% by late 1944 signifies a truly profound tactical advancement of World War II. This remarkable improvement was realized not by virtue of advanced material or numerical superiority, but through comprehending and leveraging human cognitive processes instead of contending with them. Legions of aircrew, otherwise destined for demise, persevered in their missions. Adversary aircraft that might have eluded capture were instead dispatched in fiery descent, and aerial bombardment efforts that could have faltered ultimately achieved their objectives. All these successes stem from the eventual recognition that innate human intuition, potent though it may be, could nevertheless be fallacious, and that continued existence necessitated conditioning individuals to disregard their natural inclinations and instead rely upon the immutable dictates of physics. The gunners who learned to direct their sights towards vacant expanses, who compelled themselves to discharge weaponry at seemingly empty air, and have faith their projectiles would intersect with their metallic quarry, furnish crucial evidence regarding human resilience and flexibility when subjected to duress. Humanity is not merely a captive of its primordial impulses. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and enough desperation, individuals can reconfigure their inherent reactions to align with empirical truth, rather than insisting that actuality conform to their preconceived notions. That profound lesson, forged amidst the crucible of conflict across the European and Pacific theaters, retains its profound pertinence wherever individuals encounter circumstances where innate impulse and optimal resolution diverge.